All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that I think a lot of folks here in the DMV can relate to. African immigrant parents and, raising kids in a culture that can honestly feel pretty different from their own.
Yeah, definitely a really interesting dynamic. I mean, you come here, you're looking for opportunity, you want a better life for your family, but you're also kind of thrust into this whole other cultural world. And sometimes the values you bring with you, yeah, well, they clash with the realities here.
It's like our source was saying. You come in wanting to pass down things like respect for elders, discipline, strong community, and then you run right into American individualism and even like street culture, stuff that's basically the opposite of everything you're trying to teach your kids.
And, the clash can be really stark. For
Yeah.
example, there's this case the analysis mentions right here in the DMV. Ghanaian parent used a traditional disciplinary method, like a small switch, and ended up getting investigated by Child Protective Services. Just goes to show how what's normal in one culture can have some serious consequences in another.
Man, that's a rough situation. And it's not even just about discipline. The source also talks about how the whole "it takes a village" thing, community raising a child, it can get misinterpreted here. They give an example of a Nigerian mother in Maryland who was actually reported to social services because she was seen scolding a kid, and it wasn't even her own kid.
Right, yeah, that idea that anyone in the community can step in and correct a child, it just doesn't fly here. In the U.S., it comes off as overstepping, you
Yeah.
know?
Interfering. Like, you're playing a game with a totally different rule book. And speaking of rules, it's interesting because our source even mentions how schools here, they actually encourage kids to question authority and stuff, which on one hand is great for critical thinking, but for parents who believe in absolute obedience as respect, it can make them feel like their efforts are being undermined.
Yeah, that can create a ton of tension in families. Kids are getting mixed messages. Parents feel like their authority is challenged. It's a recipe for conflict, really.
So we've got this major culture clash going on, but then our source also brings up this other element to the story, something called the brains. What exactly is that?
So, the brains is a term for a specific group of young people in the DMV's African immigrant community. They're usually first generation Americans, often highly educated, and they're super integrated into American culture, but they also still have strong ties to their heritage. It's this fascinating kind of blend of tradition and modernity.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It sounds like they're navigating this whole cultural thing in a way their parents might not fully grasp. Like they're almost acting as cultural ambassadors in a way,
Yeah.
bridging these two worlds.
You got it. They represent the potential for adaptation and integration, but they also face unique challenges that we'll get into a bit later.
Okay, so we've got this culture clash, different expectations, and now this interesting group called the brains. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the parents themselves. What are some of the things that make it harder for them to bridge this cultural gap?
Well, one of the biggest is just the sheer lack of time that a lot of these parents have. Many of them work multiple jobs, long hours just to get by, and that leaves them both physically and emotionally drained.
So they're stuck in this constant struggle to just survive,
Right.
right? Providing for their families, but it ends up costing them time with their kids.
Exactly. And because they aren't as present, as actively involved in their children's lives, it can be misinterpreted,
Yeah.
People see them not being there and assume it's because they don't care, but that's rarely the case.
It's not about lack of love, it's about circumstances. And I'd say that this isn't just an African immigrant thing either. Plenty of working class families, no matter their background, they struggle with the same thing.
Yeah, that's true. And that's why it's so important to talk about this, to understand that family life can be really complicated, especially when economic pressures put a strain on relationships.
The source also mentions another factor, what they call cultural naivety. Some parents, especially those who come here without much experience with American culture, they might just assume that schools and churches will take care of the parenting, fill in the gaps.
Right, but of course, that's not really how it works. Schools teach, churches offer guidance, but they can't replace a parent, especially not in a society as complex as ours.
So then what happens when that parental guidance isn't there? What fills the void?
Well, that's when we start to see the influence of what the source refers to as street culture. This whole other set of values and behaviors that often clashes with what the parents are trying to teach.
And that's where things start to get really interesting and, honestly, a little concerning.
Yeah, definitely raises some important questions about how young people deal with these competing influences and how families can stay connected despite the pressures they face. But we'll dig more into that after we take a quick break.
All right, we're back and still digging into this world of African immigrant families here in the DMV, especially, where those ideas of parental guidance and what the source calls street culture start to clash. Before the break, we were talking about how when parents aren't around as much, it creates this kind of void.
Yeah, it's like nature abhors a vacuum,
Yeah.
right? Something's got to fill that space.
And a lot of times it's filled with values and behaviors that are totally different from what the parents want for their kids. The source uses this phrase, the streets as educator, which is kind of powerful, to describe what can happen when young people don't have that strong parental influence.
Yeah, it's a pretty striking image.
So instead of learning about respect for elders, being part of the community, they're picking up a whole different set of rules. What's some examples of how this plays out here in the DMV?
Well, the source talks about how in some communities, kids are exposed to drugs and crime really early, like it just becomes part of the landscape. They're seeing things their parents never even imagined back home. And it goes beyond illegal stuff. It's also the attitude, how they talk, the way they dress. Like it all sends a message of rebelling, rejecting authority.
And that's got to be incredibly tough for parents who are trying to hold on to their own culture and traditions. It's almost like fighting a losing battle.
It can definitely feel that way, especially when you think about how many of these parents are dealing with their own stuff, trauma, displacement, loss. They're trying to build a good life for their kids, a stable environment, but sometimes they're living in neighborhoods where violence and poverty are just all around.
So it's deeper than just culture clashing. It's about clashing realities. These parents are up against forces that are way bigger than them.
Yeah, for sure. And the consequences can be really tough. The source mentions things like kids becoming alienated from their families, losing touch with their cultural roots, even getting in trouble with the law. It's a cycle that's hard to escape.
It's heartbreaking to think about. But is it all bad news? Is there any hope for these families?
Well, the source doesn't say it's hopeless. It actually emphasizes that there are things that can be done, like strategies that parents can use to reconnect with their kids and bridge the gap. It's not about getting rid of American culture or trying to make a little Africa in the DMV. It's about finding a way to blend the two, create a new kind of culture that respects the past and the present.
Okay, so let's get into solutions then. What are some practical things that parents can do to, reclaim that influence?
One of the most important, according to the source, is prioritizing family time. We talked about how busy these parents are, but even just finding a little bit of time to spend together can make a huge difference. Being present, engaged, really listening to your kids.
So it's not just about putting down the phone,
Right.
right? It's about actively engaging with your kids, showing them that they are the priority.
Exactly. And another thing is, get to know your kids' friends. Who are they hanging out with? What do they believe in? What kind of influences are they exposed to? It's not about controlling them. It's about being informed.
Like they say, show me your friends and I'll tell you who you are. Makes sense. If you know who your kids are with, you understand more about what's shaping them.
Right. And then there's teaching them about their culture,
Yeah.
sharing their heritage, language, traditions, help them understand where they come from, what makes their culture special.
So it's not about rejecting American culture. It's about adding to it,
Yeah.
showing them that their background is something to be proud of.
Exactly. And it's not just about celebrating the good stuff either. It's also about talking honestly about the challenges their culture might face, the prejudices they might encounter. It's about giving them the tools to deal with those things in a healthy way.
Okay, so we've got spending time together, knowing their friends, teaching cultural pride. What else?
Finding a balance between discipline and love. African parents are known to be strict, which isn't always a bad thing. But the source emphasizes that discipline should come from a place of love, not anger. Set clear boundaries, but also be supportive and communicate openly.
So making sure that even when kids mess up, they know they're still loved, that their parents are there for them no matter what.
Absolutely. And lastly, staying involved in their education. Keep track of their progress, talk to their teachers, show them that you care about their success. Remember, for a lot of immigrant parents, education is the key to a better life. It's why they came to America in the first place.
This is all great advice, really practical stuff. But I got to ask, is it ever too late? What about families where the kids are already, deep into street culture? Is there any way to turn things around?
It's a good question. And sure, it's definitely harder to connect with a teenager who's already pushing boundaries. But the source doesn't say it's impossible. It really stresses that it's never too late to try. Even if it starts later, being a present parent can still have a huge impact. It's about rebuilding connections, showing them that even with cultural differences, that love and support is still there.
So don't give up. Keep trying even when it's tough. Believe that things can change.
That's it. And it's important to remember that this isn't just on the parents either. Communities need to step up too. We should be asking ourselves, how can we support these families? How can we help bridge the gap?
So it's about creating a more welcoming environment where everyone feels valued, no matter where they're from.
Yeah, where everyone has a chance to succeed. We're all part of this together, and we have to support each other.
That's a powerful message. And it actually leads perfectly into the last part of our deep dive, where we'll hear about what it's like to be a young person walking this cultural tightrope, caught between their parents and the pull of American culture.
It's a perspective we don't hear enough about, so stick around. We're going to hear directly from the brains.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about the parents, but now let's flip the script and talk about the kids themselves. Remember the brains, the ones kind of stuck between their parents' expectations and what it's like growing up in America.
It's got to be a wild ride, right? Like growing up with two sets of rules, two sets of values, all pulling you in different directions.
I can imagine it gets pretty exhausting. And lonely too, like who can you even talk to when you're feeling that pull?
That's where being able to talk openly with your parents becomes so important. The source makes a big point about how kids need to be able to tell their parents what's going on, their frustrations, confusion, even anger. It's not about disrespect, it's about being able to talk things through.
But that's easier said than done, isn't it? Especially when there's cultural differences, language barriers, even just the whole generation gap thing.
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to bridge that gap, especially when you're a teenager and you're just trying to figure out who you are. That's why the source talks about the importance of having someone who can kind of translate between these two worlds.
So like an older sibling who's been there, maybe an aunt or uncle, a mentor, someone who gets both sides and can help everyone communicate.
Exactly. Someone who can help the kids and the parents see things from the other's point of view, understand what each generation is going through.
And it sounds like the parents really need to be ready to listen, to actually hear what their kids are trying to say, even if it's not easy to hear.
That's huge. It's about letting their kids know that their experiences matter, that their feelings are real, recognizing that their kids are growing up in a completely different world with pressures and temptations that maybe they didn't have to deal with.
It's about empathy, right? Putting yourself in your kids' shoes.
And realizing that becoming part of American culture doesn't have to mean rejecting their own heritage. It's about finding that mix, creating a new identity that honors both sides.
It's like making a fusion dish, taking the best parts of different cultures and creating something totally new and delicious.
I love that analogy because that's really what it's all about, finding that balance. It's not always easy, but it can be done. And it makes such a difference for the kids and the whole family.
Stronger families,
Yeah.
kids who can handle anything, and a more interesting culture for everyone. It's a win-win all around. But let's talk about the kids themselves for a minute. What does it take to walk this cultural tightrope? What helps them thrive?
Well, the source talks a lot about resilience, being able to adapt, and having a strong sense of self. These kids are constantly switching back and forth between cultures, and that takes a lot of flexibility and awareness. They also need to know who they are and be able to stand up to peer pressure and stay true to their values, even when those values are different from everyone else's.
Sounds like they're learning some pretty valuable life lessons, skills that'll help them no matter what they end up doing.
You got it. And it's honestly inspiring to see how many of these young people aren't just getting by, they're excelling, they're doing great in school, following their passions, becoming leaders in their communities. It shows that being different isn't a weakness, it's a strength.
It reminds us that diversity is something to celebrate, not fear. It makes our communities better, gives us new perspectives.
And we can't forget the resilience of the families themselves. Despite all the challenges, they find ways to keep their traditions alive, pass on their values, create a sense of belonging for their kids.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. It shows the power of love, family, and culture. And it's a story that more people need to hear. It can inspire all of us to be more open-minded and create a society where everyone feels like they belong.
Absolutely. I think the big takeaway from our deep dive today is that, yeah, the challenges are real, but there are also solutions. It takes open communication, empathy, understanding different cultures, and a whole lot of resilience. But we have to remember that we're all in this together, trying to build a better future for ourselves and for future generations.
Well said. And to all our listeners out there, Keep asking questions, keep learning about these important topics, and keep talking about them. The more we understand each other, the stronger we become as a community, as a society, as people.
Couldn't agree more. That's all for a deep dive today. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep diving deep.